Most of the things you and I treat as reality aren't real in the way a mountain is real. A mountain will still be there when you stop believing in it. But a bank balance, a passport, a corporation, a national border, a law, a human right, those things only work because millions of people agree to treat them as true. If that agreement breaks, the reality breaks with it. That's the unsettling, powerful lens at the heart of Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. It isn't just a timeline of events. It's an attempt to reveal the hidden operating system of civilization, the stories that make strangers cooperate, the systems that reward populations more than individuals, and the technologies that may soon rewrite what it even means to be human. And if you're the kind of person who wants to keep working on your self-development by accessing clear, expert-level summaries of the world's most renowned authors, please take a second to like, share, and comment on this video. Not as a favor to me as a creator, but as a small vote for the kind of content you want more of on your feed. Now, fair warning, Sapiens is a wide-angle book. It compresses tens of thousands of years into one narrative arc and draws lines between biology, history, economics, and philosophy. Harari shaped the material from his world history teaching into a book for general readers, which is one reason it feels so direct and readable. It's also why critics sometimes argue it moves too fast, flattens nuance, or occasionally overstates certainty. To make sense of it without getting lost, picture the book as a 4-act documentary. Act 1 is the cognitive revolution, how humans developed a special kind of language and imagination that lets small bands become large networks. Act 2 is the agricultural revolution, why settling down and farming might have been a trade-off rather than an uncomplicated upgrade. Act 3 is the unification of humankind, how money, empires, and religions stitched many local cultures into bigger systems, pushing the world toward interdependence. Act 4 is the scientific revolution, how admitting ignorance and investing in discovery transformed politics, economics, technology, and now, increasingly, the human body itself. And before we dive in, I want to invite you into a quick ritual that fits the soul of this book. Harari's core claim is that humans don't only live in the physical world. We live in a story world, beliefs, categories, identities, and meanings that feel solid because other people keep agreeing with them. So if you're watching and you're willing to look at your own everyday realities with fresh eyes, type this in the comments. I see the story. It's short, easy to type, and it signals something important. You're choosing awareness over autopilot. Keep that phrase in mind as we go. Every time we mention money, nation, religion, or rights, ask yourself, where is the physical object, and where is the shared agreement? Harari's book is basically a training exercise in this skill, seeing the invisible architecture that holds the visible world in place. And once you can see that architecture, you can also see how fragile it is, how quickly it can change, and how much power sits with the people who can shape the story. All right. Now we begin where Sapiens begins, with the humbling reminder that we were not always the only humans on Earth, and that our dominance was never guaranteed. For much of prehistory, Homo sapiens shared the planet with other human species. In Harari's framing, it's not enough to say humans evolved. It matters that, at one point, there were multiple human lineages living at the same time, and today, there's only one. That raises a deeper question than how did we evolve? The deeper question is, why us? Even in modern genetic research, there's evidence that the boundaries between these groups weren't always absolute. But, in the end, sapiens remained, and the others disappeared. Harari uses that fact to punch a hole in our self-image. We think of ourselves as the natural destination of evolution, when in reality, we're just one contingent outcome. So what changed? In Harari's story, the turning point wasn't primarily physical. It wasn't that sapiens suddenly became the strongest predators. Instead, sapiens developed a kind of mind that could coordinate differently. Other animals communicate in basic ways. Many are intelligent. Some even use tools. But humans began using language not only to describe the world, but to create shared worlds, imagined realities that could hold large groups together. Harari's signature explanation is that sapiens became dominant because we can cooperate flexibly in large numbers. A wolf pack works because the wolves know each other personally. A chimp group works through direct social relationships and constant observation. But once a community grows beyond the size where everyone knows everyone, something new has to happen. You need a different kind of glue. That glue, Harari argues, is fiction. Not fiction as in lies, but fiction as in things that exist because we collectively believe in them. Gods in his examples. Nations. Money. Legal systems. Human rights. Companies. These are not physical facts like gravity, but they can still shape behavior more powerfully than gravity, because they coordinate millions of minds at once. This is the moment where Sapiens quietly rewrites the meaning of intelligence. In Harari's framing, intelligence isn't only problem-solving. It's story-building. It's the ability to create an invisible agreement that people will die for, pay for, and organize their lives around. This is how you get armies, religions, trade networks, courts, and corporations, structures too large for face-to-face trust, yet stable enough to last for centuries. And here's a subtle move Harari makes. He invites you to notice that many of your realistic adult priorities are powered by shared imagination. Nobody has ever touched the economy with their hands. Nobody has ever seen a nation as a biological object. Yet, people rearrange their lives around these abstractions, and the abstractions become real forces precisely because we act as if they are real. That's what he means by imagined realities, not hallucinations, but collectively maintained social facts. Harari adds another ingredient that feels surprisingly human: gossip. In small groups, social survival depends on knowing who can be trusted, who broke norms, who is allied with whom. Harari points to gossip as a tool that stabilizes cooperation. Because once you can talk about other people, you can enforce social rules without needing written law. Gossip sounds petty, but in this framing, it's a primitive form of governance. It creates reputation, and reputation creates order. From there, the book widens again to the birth of imagined orders. An imagined order is the story that tells people how the world is arranged, who is high status, who is low status, what is sacred, what is sinful, what is legal, what is forbidden, what counts as normal. These orders feel natural to people living inside them. They can be justified as divine law, scientific fact, moral truth, or common sense. But Harari keeps nudging you to notice something uncomfortable. Many orders are historically contingent. They change. They can be rewritten. That's why revolutions are possible. People can stop believing, start believing, or simply rewrite the rules they grew up with. The moment a society changes the story it treats as sacred or obvious, the visible world changes too. Laws, hierarchies, borders, even the meaning of a person. At this point, Harari asks you to hold two truths at once. Truth 1. Shared fictions are the superpower of sapiens. They enable law, science, financial systems, and moral communities that extend beyond family. Truth 2. Shared fictions can also justify cruelty at scale. A small band can persecute a few outsiders. A large civilization can persecute millions. because it has the stories, institutions, and habits to make that persecution feel normal, necessary, or sacred. Harari even argues that because societies rely on shared myths, they can bake in bias and discrimination, and that a perfectly neutral social order may be impossible. This theme becomes even more confronting when Harari turns to human migration and ecological impact. As sapiens moved into new habitats, ecosystems changed, sometimes dramatically. Harari has argued publicly that the spread of humans often coincided with waves of extinction among large animals, long before modern industry. The message is blunt. Humans began reshaping nature with stone tools and fire, not only with factories. So, the environmental crisis isn't only a modern story. It's part of a much older relationship between human success and non-human loss. Harari doesn't leave the point abstract. He describes a repeated sequence. Before humans arrive, rich variety. After humans, far fewer large animals. The details differ by region, but the emotional implication is consistent. If we want an honest story about human triumph, we can't only count what we built. We also have to count what disappeared. Now Harari takes a step most history books skip. He asks what everyday life might have felt like, tens of thousands of years ago. The honest answer is that we can't know with certainty. Evidence is thin. Archaeologists reconstruct daily life from bones, tools, fire pits, burials, and a handful of other clues. Even Harari's own published references acknowledge how contested these questions are. Family structures, monogamy, violence, religion, leadership, different bands could have lived very differently. But Harari still sketches a contrast that sets up the next act. Hunter-gatherer societies, in his picture, are societies of flexibility, moving with seasons, relying on broad knowledge of plants and animals, and maintaining social arrangements that fit small group life. He also notes an influential hypothesis, debated but famous, that some foraging groups may have had more leisure and more dietary variety than later peasants, because they weren't locked into growing a single staple crop year after year. At the same time, Harari refuses to romanticize the past. Pre-agricultural life included injury without modern medicine, infant mortality, sudden starvation when luck turned, and the constant vulnerability of living close to nature. His bigger point isn't foragers were happier. It's that the story of progress is complicated. A society can become more powerful on paper, while ordinary people inside it become more constrained. That contrast, the flexible band inside nature versus the dense settlement inside an imagined order, is the doorway into Act 2. Act 2 is the agricultural revolution, and Harari treats it like a turning point with a shadow. In the standard school story of history, agriculture is progress. Humans learn to plant crops, domesticate animals, store surplus food, build villages, and civilization begins. We leave the uncertainty of foraging and enter the stability of farming. Harari refuses to tell it that cleanly. He agrees that agriculture enabled population growth and complex societies, but he argues that it may have increased suffering for many individuals, humans and animals. He draws a distinction that becomes central to the whole book. What benefits the species or the system doesn't necessarily benefit the average person living inside it. Here's the trade-off in plain language. Farming can produce more total food from a given territory, which supports more people. But a farming lifestyle can also involve harder, more repetitive labor than a foraging lifestyle. It can narrow diets and increase vulnerability to famine when crops fail. It can bring people and animals into closer daily contact, increasing diseases that thrive in dense settlements. And it can create new forms of inequality, because land, surplus, storage, and inheritance invite control, Someone guards it, someone manages it, someone makes rules about it, and someone enforces those rules. Once land becomes property and surplus becomes storage, society starts producing not only farmers, but also landlords, tax collectors, priests, soldiers, and administrators. Harari's argument is not agriculture was evil. It's that agriculture can create a treadmill. Once a community commits to farming, population tends to rise. Once population rises, you can't easily go back, because the land can't support as many people without intensive cultivation. So the society becomes locked in. Even if the system makes individual lives harder, leaving becomes almost impossible. The system expands because it works at the level of growth, even if many people inside it feel exhausted. This is one of Harari's recurring patterns. History often rewards systems, not individuals. Farming wins if your measure is total calories or total humans. But farming may not win if your measure is daily well-being, freedom of movement, or the intensity of labor. Harari uses this pattern to challenge the modern intuition that history is always a ladder of improvement. Then he applies the same logic to domesticated animals. In Harari's moral framing, domesticated animals are the hidden backbone of civilization. Agriculture is not only wheat and barley. It is cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, new life forms engineered by human selection. Harari argues that domestication created a strange kind of evolutionary success. Animal populations explode in number, yet individual animals can suffer deeply, especially when their social and emotional needs are ignored. In his public writing, Harari makes a core ethical claim. The fate of industrially farmed animals is one of the most urgent moral questions of our time, because the numbers are enormous and the suffering can be systematic. He points out a tragic irony. Modern science helps humans control disease and reproduction in farm animals, which makes it possible to keep huge populations alive under extreme conditions. Modern knowledge can be used to reduce suffering or to industrialize it. Whether you agree with Harari's moral vocabulary or not, his historical point is hard to ignore. Human power over other species didn't begin with modern factories. It began once we shifted from living among wild animals to owning and breeding animals as economic units. Industrial farming, in this view, is not a separate moral category. It's an intensification of a very old relationship. Sapiens also uses agriculture to explore how imagined orders harden into hierarchies. In small foraging groups, status can be fluid. In large farming settlements, status becomes institutional. Class systems can emerge because surplus enables specialization. Some people farm, some people fight, some people pray, some people record and tax. Harari's broader argument is that inequality is often stabilized through stories, myths of superiority and inferiority, laws about purity, categories of natural hierarchy that make domination feel justified. He emphasizes how hierarchies can feel obvious to those living inside them. If a system tells you this is how the world works, it becomes hard to imagine alternatives. In that sense, hierarchy isn't only enforced by violence. It's enforced by imagination and habit. This is also where the book connects private life to public systems. Agriculture leads to settlement. Settlement leads to property. Property leads to inheritance. Inheritance leads to stronger regulation of lineage, marriage, and social roles. Harari suggests that the organization of families and gender expectations can't be separated from economic realities. When survival depends on land and labor, societies tend to regulate reproduction and inheritance more intensely. The personal becomes political, not as a slogan, but as a survival strategy. Another shift Harari emphasizes is specialization. Farming societies can support people who don't produce food directly. Artisans, priests, soldiers, administrators. That can unlock writing, engineering, and art. Harari's point is that these achievements are real. The book's argument is not that civilization created nothing beautiful. It's that beauty and suffering can grow together, because history doesn't guarantee well-being as the price of complexity. Running alongside all of this is Harari's recurring question. Did we get happier? It feels like it should have a clear answer. Surely, better tools, bigger houses, longer lives mean more happiness. Yet, Harari repeatedly returns to the tension between power and well-being. The story of civilization might be the story of increasing control over nature and increasing complexity in social life. And complexity can mean stress, coercion, and relentless status competition. Even readers who disagree with Harari's strongest claims often remember this part because it challenges a modern assumption that history is a ladder climbing upward and that the well-being of individuals is aligned with the success of the system. Now, before we go further, here's your second micro-commitment, right around the middle, where people usually drift away. If Sapiens is making you notice how many invisible narratives shaped your choices, how many rules of life are actually stories, comment this. I choose perspective. It's a small, symbolic declaration that you're willing to zoom out and see the bigger pattern, rather than getting trapped inside the default script. Act 3 is the unification of humankind. After agriculture, human history becomes, at least in Harari's telling, less about isolated cultures and more about integration. Over long stretches of time, trade networks widen, political systems expand, and belief systems spread. Harari argues that the general direction has been toward greater interdependence, fewer isolated human worlds, more shared global systems. He doesn't claim this unification is peaceful. Much of it is violent. But he insists it's real, and he builds this part around a framework that is both simple and surprisingly deep. Money, empire, and universal religion. First, money. Harari treats money as a technology of trust. Not trust between family members, but trust between strangers. It allows you to exchange value with someone you don't know, in a place you've never visited, under rules you didn't personally negotiate. That's almost magical when you think about it. Money doesn't remove conflict, but it gives strangers a shared language for cooperation. Harari's larger point is that money isn't only economic. It is cultural and psychological. It changes what people value. It changes what they can imagine. It creates incentives and habits. It makes it possible to specialize, trade at distance, and build complex projects that would collapse if everyone had to personally verify everyone else's trustworthiness. It can also flatten diverse values into numbers, which can be efficient, but can encourage moral blindness when everything becomes price. Second, empire. Harari knows the word empire triggers moral reflexes, and with reason. Yet his focus is structural. Empires standardize. They unify many peoples under one administration. They impose languages, laws, and taxes. They build roads, bureaucracies, and institutions. They move armies and goods. They often blend cultures, sometimes through coercion, sometimes through exchange. Harari's framing is intentionally uncomfortable. Even when empires are brutal, they can also be historically effective at creating large, integrated systems that outlast individual rulers. This is one reason Harari insists we can't talk about globalization as a purely modern trend. Earlier systems of conquest and trade already pushed humans into wider networks. The modern world, in his view, is the continuation of that long, unifying process. Third, Universal religion. Harari draws a distinction between local spirits and universal truth claims. Some belief systems bind a particular group. Others claim a moral or metaphysical order that applies to everyone. When a religion becomes universal in that way, it can unify people who would otherwise remain separate. This is where Harari becomes provocative about the relationship between belief and power. Religions can restrain violence. They can also legitimize it. They can create compassion across communities. They can also create fierce boundaries between us and them. In Harari's framing, religion is not a footnote to politics. It is one of the major engines of shared meaning that makes large-scale order possible. If you step back, you can see the pattern. Money, empire, and religion. These aren't just topics. They're mechanisms of scaling. They are ways to turn many small worlds into fewer large ones. And because Harari loves to challenge labels, he sometimes describes modern systems using religious language. He claims, for example, that capitalism behaves like a religion because it creates a moral worldview and a faith in growth that coordinates behavior at scale. You don't have to accept the analogy completely to understand the move. He's highlighting the role of collective belief in every large human project, from ancient temples to modern stock markets. This part of the book is also where Harari's tone becomes quietly unsettling. The unification of humankind isn't described as an inevitable march toward harmony. It's described as a process that can erase as well as connect. Local languages and rituals vanish. Small cultures collapse into larger ones. Diversity often gives way to uniform systems that are easier to administer, trade with, and tax. A single global civilization can bring cooperation, but it can also spread the same injustices everywhere, because when the rules are global, so are the mistakes. A single powerful myth can spread across continents and outcompete local alternatives, not necessarily because it's truer, but because it is better at organizing people, money, and force. Now we're approaching the point where the book pivots hard into modernity. So here's a quick, earned reminder for the people who are still here. If this summary is helping you see history and your own life through a sharper lens, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys big ideas, and add a comment. You're not just boosting a channel. You're joining a small corner of YouTube that tries to reward depth over noise. Act 4 is the scientific revolution, and in Harari's telling, it is the moment the story of humanity becomes the story of a new kind of power. The scientific revolution begins with a deceptively small change: the willingness to admit ignorance. For much of history, many societies believed the important answers already existed. In sacred texts, in tradition, in the wisdom of ancestors. The modern scientific mindset starts with a different assumption: we don't know. That ignorance isn't shameful, it's fuel. It becomes the reason to explore, measure, experiment, and revise. Harari links that mental shift to modern dominance because it trains whole societies to invest in knowledge. It creates institutions like universities, laboratories, journals, and research programs. It doesn't guarantee moral wisdom, but it generates power. Power to cure diseases, to engineer materials, to build machines, to map genomes. Harari, and reviewers who discuss this part, connect scientific exploration to imperial expansion. Empires fund voyages, mapping, botany, linguistics, and resource surveys. Scientific knowledge improves navigation, weapons, medicine, and administration. That improved capacity helps empires expand further. It's a feedback loop of knowledge and conquest, and Harari uses it to explain why the last few centuries transformed the world so rapidly. But science doesn't float in a vacuum, and Harari is explicit about that. Science is expensive. It needs patronage. It needs political and economic support. So Harari brings in capitalism again, not as a synonym for markets, but as a story about growth and the future. In his narrative, modern economies operate on confidence that tomorrow can be larger than today, that investment can create returns, that growth is normal, that progress will continue. This belief encourages credit, risk-taking, and reinvestment. It also helps fund science, because scientific research requires long timelines and uncertainty. You need a culture willing to invest now for benefits later. This is where you can feel Harari's deeper concern. Civilizations can become trapped inside their own success stories. If growth is sacred, then slowing down looks like sin. If technology equals progress, then caution looks like ignorance. Harari keeps reminding the reader that stories can become addictive, even when they drive real improvement. Then comes the cascade of modern revolutions that reviewers describe: industrialization, information systems, and what some call the biotechnological phase. Industrialization transforms energy and production. Machines multiply output. Cities expand. Consumption becomes a social habit. And human relationships change, because work, family life, and even identity adapt to the demands of mass society. Harari argues that modern states and markets replace functions once performed by families and communities. Need protection? Police and armies. Need healthcare? Institutions. Need pensions? Systems. Need meaning? Ideologies and consumer brands. Individuals gain freedom from village supervision, but they also become more dependent on large impersonal systems. This is one reason *Sapiens* feels like a book about the present dressed as a book about the past. Harari wants you to see that your identity, your sense of who you are, is shaped by institutions, incentives, and cultural myths that did not exist for most of human history. And now we return to the question Harari keeps asking like a drumbeat: happiness. Harari highlights that despite dramatic increases in human power, medicine, travel, communication, it's not obvious that subjective well-being has risen in the same proportion. He treats this as one of the great unanswered questions of history. Technology can multiply comfort, but it can also multiply comparison, anxiety, and expectations. A mind shaped for small group survival can struggle in a world of constant information, abstract stressors, and relentless competition for status. Some critics argue Harari's happiness discussion overreaches or moves too quickly through contested evidence. Even so, many readers remember it because it forces an honest moment. If the goal of civilization is human well-being, then we should measure well-being directly, not assume it rises alongside power. Finally, *Sapiens* reaches its most destabilizing hypothesis: Homo sapiens may be temporary. In interviews, Harari has argued that after billions of years of evolution by natural selection, science may enable humans to change the underlying rules, moving from evolution by selection to evolution by design, and potentially creating entirely new forms of life. He has also argued that technologies like genetic engineering could allow humans to redesign bodies, and perhaps even minds, and that rapid progress in computing could create non-biological intelligence that competes with, merges with, or perhaps even replaces us. This isn't presented as a guaranteed prophecy. It's presented as a warning. The decisions ahead may be among the most consequential in history, because they reach into the foundations of life itself. Harari also hints at a darker practical problem. If enhancement technologies become normal, they can trigger an arms race. When upgrading is optional at first, but socially rewarded, people may feel pushed into it just to keep up. And when upgrades cost money, inequality stops being only about education or income. It becomes biological, and cognitive too. Differences in memory, attention, emotional regulation, and even lifespan. His wider warning is that this kind of transformation can move faster than our ethical and legal systems. Research and entrepreneurship reward speed, competition, and market advantage. Governments often react slowly, especially when technologies begin as medical fixes and quietly slide into enhancement for healthy people. That creates a familiar pattern. Tools built for healing become tools for optimization. Optimization becomes a norm. The norm becomes a pressure, and pressure becomes inequality. That's why Harari ends with an ethical question that sticks like a thorn. In a future of bioengineering, it may not be enough to ask, what do we want to become? The deeper question could be, what do we want to want? Because if technology can reshape desire, motivation, and identity, ethics has to move upstream. The challenge isn't only to build powerful tools. The challenge is to build wise beings. Now, a grounding note, because this is where criticism of *Sapiens* becomes relevant. The book is exhilarating precisely because it's huge. But that hugeness comes with risk. Reviewers and critics have praised Harari's clarity and synthesis, while also accusing him of carelessness, exaggeration, or turning contested debates into clean narratives. The best way to read *Sapiens* is as a grand, provocative map, a way to see patterns across history, rather than as a perfectly precise answer key. Let it expand your frame, then keep learning from specialist work where nuance and disagreement live. And with that, let's pull the whole architecture into one final, memorable takeaway. *Sapiens* begins by shrinking your ego. Humans are animals, and sapiens were once just another animal in Africa. It explains our dominance, not through claws or fangs, but through shared imagination, language that lets strangers cooperate by believing in the same stories. It challenges the comforting myth that agriculture was a simple upgrade, arguing instead that farming built powerful societies, while often increasing labor, hierarchy, and animal exploitation. It traces how money, empires, and religions expanded those societies until the world began behaving like one interconnected system. Underneath all of that history is a profoundly practical message: become fluent in the stories you live inside. Nations are narratives. Markets are narratives. Status is a narrative. Even your personal sense of a normal life is partly inherited. Once you notice that, you gain a strange kind of freedom. You can examine the scripts you've been given and decide which deserve your loyalty. But there's a warning attached. Stories don't just empower us. They can manipulate us. They can justify cruelty. They can turn growth into a god. They can turn technology into destiny. They can make people treat other humans and other animals as disposable. So the self-development takeaway from *Sapiens* isn't simply learn history. It's learn awareness. Awareness that you are a story-making creature. Awareness that your mind can cooperate with millions of strangers or be influenced by millions of strangers. Awareness that the future will be shaped not only by inventions, but by choices. Choices about ethics, power, compassion, and the kind of beings we want to build. If you want one concrete practice after this video, do this. Pick one thing in your daily life that feels unquestionable. Money, nationality, career success, social status, and ask, what story makes this feel real? Not to destroy it. Just to see it. That's where clarity begins. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this summary helped you, please like, share, and comment. Your support is what lets us keep producing deep, transformational breakdowns. And with that, see you in the next summary.